Hello, this is the lecture for week 2 on the historical books and the writings. I'm going to try to run through them both. It might be a slightly longer video this time as I'm going through basically the entire week in one video. Um, First, on the historical books, I'll just get right into it. The historical books are not like our modern understanding of history to begin with, even though we call them historical. They are not the kind of thing that an academic historian today might be doing, where you're trying to figure out the facts, recount them as objectively as possible, maybe even give different perspectives, try not to be biased. The whole point here is to be biased. This is history told as persuasive theology, talking about the past as an argument, as a convincing argument about how people should behave in the present. These are the mistakes or successes our ancestors made. Therefore, this is how we should behave today, right? That's kind of the weight of them. And so these books tell the history from the death of Moses, right, which we reached at Deuteronomy, through the period of the judges, where Israel is following these people called judges, these war leaders, we'll see, to the period of the united Jewish kingdom. So this timeline, I hopefully will become clear in your head. This is the overarching structure of timeline of basically the history of Israel as told from the time of Moses. So we had the patriarchs, then we have Moses. Hopefully, this is in your head. If you need to, you can make notes or take down, write a little timeline to get an idea. These are the main points, right? These are the major points along the way. So there's Moses, right, out of Egypt, going through the wilderness, reaching the good land. Then the judges, once they're in the land, being led by these war leaders. There's a united kingdom of Israel at one point, or united Jewish kingdom. Then this kingdom gets divided. There's a northern kingdom that gets called Israel, southern kingdom called Judah, and then there is the kind of downfall of these two kingdoms after a period of independence. Israel goes to Assyria, and then about 150 years or so later, Judah goes to Babylon. So they're both taken into exile, and then finally they tell the story of the return from exile back to the good land, the land of Israel, the land of Palestine, this promised land. And then the Maccabees books, which we are not covered in Protestant or Jewish versions of the Bible, they skip into the future past the Alexandrian period and the Alexander's to the period where the generals, who were the successors of Alexander, set up their own dynasties, and a Jewish group called the Maccabees fight a war of independence and win, right? And that brings us to just a couple hundred years before Jesus, where we're going to take up the New Testament eventually. Okay, so Martin Noth suggested in 1943 that Joshua Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings basically all share Deuteronomy's idea on the importance of worshiping in Jerusalem, that God's people can keep the land and flourish in it only if they worship the one God in the one place, Jerusalem temple, right? And that this is the essence of this kind of bilateral covenant. You worship God correctly, He will keep you in this land. The theory's gotten more complicated, but for the purposes of this book, we'll talk of a Deuteronomist, just one, as if there's one writer, as long as we understand that it's probably many people over many years writing, editing, creating this these works from Deuteronomy to Second Kings, including Joshua, Judges, and the Samuel's books. In a similar way, we have the First and Second Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, which have some similar terminology about the house of God. They all share lists and genealogies. They like using those. They're all interested in the Jerusalem temple and in the people who are staffing it, who are working there, the religious experts, the priests, the Levites. And so even though there are differences as well, and there's almost certainly different authors and editors over a long period of time, we'll talk about the chronicler in general, like the author of the Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and such. Yeah, and like the Deuteronomist, there's the chronicler has theological purposes. They're not just recording history; they are making an argument about what should be done now using history. Finally, we have the Maccabees and these short biblical novellas. They're not all covered. We'll talk about them more in the Apocrypha period. Not all Bibles have them, as I pointed out. Not Protestant Bibles and not Jewish Bibles. But the Maccabees are an important group of people that found the holiday of Hanukkah, and they win this their victory against the Seleucid Empire. Like I said, the successor empire of Alexander the Great's conquest. So, okay, the first book in our historical books will be Joshua. Famously, Joshua is about the conquest of the good land. But actually, if you look at the book, less than half of it is devoted to the conquest. What the book really spends a lot of time doing is going over these preparations before they even enter the land. There, people are warned you have to keep the law when you go there, and then before the conquest can begin, some spies are sent out. They go straight to a house of a prostitute, learn some key information, and the whole people of Israel crossed the Jordan River. And then in the actual conquest of the good land, there are some interesting stories, including with this group of people called the Gibeonites who seem to fool the Israelites. A covenant breaker named Achan or Achan, he causes the people to suffer a defeat. And so again, we see this kind of like, don't break the law, don't break this covenant. He broke the commandment of God. Now all the people suffer a loss instead of winning victory. A lot of the book of Joshua is devoted to marking out the boundaries of the tribes, which where each of the tribes will dwell in the land. And then there are final issues related to apportioning this land and warning the people, once again, in keeping with this Deuteronomic kind of interest, or you can even call it obsession, um, warning the people to keep the faith. Don't take up the ways of the surrounding nations. Don't worship their gods above all. Don't worship where they worship in all these places, but only where um, God will choose. There's a nice parallel that's set up, just like with the Exodus, they left by crossing the Red Sea. The Deuteronomist seems to be copying the Tetrarch, maybe, or if not, at least there's a nice echo here of crossing the Jordan River. We also have this etiology in Joshua. Etiology is the study of causes, the roots, a kind of mythic story, a just so story. Why things are the way they are now, and people tell these stories to explain them. So here we see etiology in why do Rahab's people live in the land? Why are the Gibeonites protected? Where do these names of cities come from? Or explaining these heaps of stones or tells, as they're called now. And a lot of them are going back to the Deuteronomist key concern. Once again, keeping the law, keeping the law. The history of Joshua, as far as how much this corresponds to archaeology and what we know, we could say that the archaeology basically does not support the story as it's told in Joshua. Again, encouraging us to think of Joshua more as theology than history. Probably this wouldn't have bothered the authors of Joshua, very much, or they wouldn't have thought that what they were doing was something that should be borne out by archaeology, but rather something that makes an important theological point. The archaeology itself doesn't give a single clear answer either about the Hebrews and how they came to live in this land or how the land was conquered. We know that a group of people did eventually begin to think of themselves as being united religiously, not just ethnically, not just linguistically, but in worship, in devotion to Yahweh alone, or as the only true God, or as higher and better than the other gods, and that this worship and these people coalesced around these kind of central highlands where Jerusalem is. If we remember the kind of geology of Israel, that central strip in which that's kind of somewhat elevated. And the theology of Joshua, clearly the covenant is central and is important. Also, that God is giving the land of Israel to the people, so the land is important. It's a book that claims that no one can defeat God's people when they're working with God and keeping this covenant. And then and it also says that the people, maybe its last point is that the people have to have strength and courage to keep this law, to obey God, to cooperate and win this land. In terms of God's relationship with humanity, what we see is on the people side, kind of failure, right? The fact that they go straight to the house of a foreign prostitute, these spies, that they need her help to defeat Jericho, the famous city of Jericho. It may be a kind of foreshadowing of the people's later, um, this kind of refrain that we're going to hear again and again about marrying into the foreign women, the peoples of the land adopting their gods, worshiping their gods. It could be a little foreshadowing there. We have there, as I mentioned already, these people called the Gibeonites kind of tricking the Israelites. And we also have the failure of Achan, again, as mentioned previously. In terms of God's side, we kind of see in Joshua, actually, God does not seem too concerned with the failures, but kind of sees them as teaching opportunities. God is giving them repeated chances and lessons to try to improve. And God is also very focused on the land. The whole story is about the taking of this land. So the land is central to God's concerns in the book of Joshua. Finally, I think it's important to note, and the authors do, that we have what we could call this problem of genocide. That Joshua frankly tells the people of Israel to kill all the peoples of the land, including children and non-combatants, right? Wipe them all out. And, we could, there are a number of responses to this kind of um, command in a holy book, right? I mean, one thing is just to simply condemn it, of course, and we could also contextualize it to some extent. There's similar language or even harsher language in other Near Eastern writings. We could point out that this is a theological argument, really, by the Deuteronomist after the exile. It's not history. It's not talking about what people actually did or should have been done, but thinking about maybe a theology. No compromise, no temptation, taking total possession of the land. What written in a period of exile or post-exile, where the Jews don't have much power, where they're surrounded by enemies, and they're thinking about how they should live in the land as an ideal form. So it doesn't have an actual massacre or genocide in mind, but it's telling them the kind of maybe no holds barred attitude that they should hold towards their own peoplehood, towards the purity of their worship, etc. But I think, again, as we began, we should end with it, that it's still a problem, almost however you look at it. At least the violence of the language is something that has to be or should be seriously grappled with by people who hold this as a holy text, right? We move on to Judges. They're not so much legal specialists. The book of Judges, these judges are not really legal specialists like in English, although they may judge among the people, they may rule over them. I think that is the idea with the word, but in action, or what we see in the book, is they're more like war leaders or military heroes. And we have these two prologues to set the stage in Judges, talking about the conquest of the land and how the people were not driven out, and this was a failure. And then the second prologue sets up how the people do what's evil. Sets up this basic pattern. The people are going to act evilly, doing whatever they want until God raises up a judge to deliver them. And then as long as the judge rules over them, all is well. But as soon as the judge dies, the people go back to their evil ways. So the book of Judges as a whole is mainly these cycles, these stories of these judges, um, uh, with one attempt, kind of disastrous attempt at kingship in the middle of all these stories. 5 stories of judges, then a attempted king, then another, 7 cycles of stories of judges. And then there's 2 epilogues that go kind of along with the 2 prologues that cement this pattern that everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes and leading to all kinds of punishment and error and tragedy on behalf of Israel. And then the second epilogue is kind of to give maybe a very specific and terrifying and terrible kind of conclusion, an example that exemplifies the absolute failure of the Israelite people at this time. There's a traveling man who is threatened with rape. Instead, he gives up his concubine, who is raped and killed. And when he comes across her body in the morning, he dismembers it and sends pieces of her body throughout Israel, leading to a war between between the different Israelite tribes as a punishment against the Benjaminites who have committed this heinous crime. That all of Israel rises up in revulsion and disgust at this evil act, transgressing murder laws, hospitality laws, um, rape, of course. And so, this is the final end of the book of Judges. The book of Judges in general, if we're thinking about the history of it, is too vague to really pin down historically. And also, the genre seems much more stories than history, even compared to these other books that we've already pointed out, are not trying to usually nail down exact facts and dates. The Judges is even more impressionistic. Um, and one of the recurring questions that you might have after reading the book of Judges is, why are the people so tempted to betray Yahweh? Why are they so tempted to betray the God of Israel, Elohim, and worship all these other gods? And probably a better way to think about this is what we're seeing is this kind of monotheistic or Yahwist belief systems or tendency, we could say a tendency, or proto-monotheism or proto-Yahwism arising out of a complex and mixed religious context. So even some of the names of these judges, suggest the importance of other gods in possibly this kind of proto or early Israeli pantheon where various gods, Baal or Baal, the Asherahs, all these alternative deities had been possibly worshipped alongside Yahweh, but increasingly there's this understanding among some of them, and Judges is part of this argument, that Yahweh alone deserves worship. The role of women is also very fascinating in Judges. Judges has some of the most powerful women and women leaders, women judges. At the same time, it has these kind of stories of terror for women. The dismembered prostitute that ends Judges 19, or the sacrifice. Jephthah is one of the judges that sacrifices his own daughter. To thank God for a military victory. And so, it's not clear, but these, we could also pay attention to the fact that we have 12 judges, right? And that there are 12 tribes. This is almost certainly not a coincidence, and probably hints at the origin of these stories as kind of these tribal heroes or kind of folklore legends among these tribes that kind of get compiled and brought together here. The theological idea is also pretty clear that there's faithfulness under good leaders, but relapse when they're not there. And there's certainly none too subtle, we could say, kind of warning about kings. The one king that's there, Abimelech, is as I said, a kind of disaster who kills 70 of his siblings to try to cement his own kingship. And this kind of ambivalence is going to continue. Whether kings are a good thing or not continues throughout the Deuteronomic works. We come now to Ruth, the next book. Ruth, it doesn't really belong in the Deuteronomic writings, but we're kind of covering them in the standard Christian canonical order. It's really there because it says it begins. So the first words of Ruth are about it, the story being set in the time of the judges, and so that's why Christian canons have placed Ruth there. It's kind of a charming little love story about a Moabitess, so not an Israelite, but who ends up becoming an ancestor to David, the future king of Israel, the kind of exemplar of all kings. And because of the mention of David, some have argued that maybe it's a praise of the kingship, a kind of royal propaganda, and so it dates to the kingdom's time of Israel. But its language, because it has some Aramaic, and the fact that Ruth is a foreign woman being grafted into David's lineage, and all these all hint at some sort of exile or post-exile. Aramaic is the language, the imperial language of the Persian Empire, and so they would point to that kind of a period. And the importance of foreigners might point to another time when foreigners are very important people to think about if Israel is surrounded by foreigners, say. It is possible that Ruth is written by a woman. Its point of view is so focused on these women protagonists, Naomi and Ruth. And if it's not by a woman, it's probably by a man who's very sensitive to women's issues, a man himself who might be married to a foreigner and might write such a book as a defense of his own kind of marriage. So in this very short book, there are a lot of kind of rich theological insights, primarily the kind of interplay between loyalty, family, and God. The basic story of Ruth. Again, you need to be reading these, but it is a story about family and loyalty that transcends even death, and then the ways that family and loyalty are supposed to be in service of God. The emphasis of the land of Israel is there, as these Jews suffer when they leave the land and then return to the land and are blessed. The line of David is obviously there, and again, as we've seen, there's a pride of place given to women in God's plan. So these are all kind of major theological themes. Now, moving on to the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, we have the story of Samuel the prophet, and then the first two examples of the first two kings in this united kingdom of Israel. before the split, that is Saul and David. So without going into all the detail, which you need to pick up from the book, Samuel is the chosen prophet of God, and then Samuel first anoints Saul to be Israel's king. Saul's failures cause God to choose David from a completely different family, a completely different tribe, and it ends with the succession. The story of the Samuels ends with Solomon as being chosen as David's heir, even though he's not David's oldest son. So it covers from Samuel's childhood all the way to Solomon being the king, with these kind of major figures: Samuel, Saul, David, Solomon. Um, First and Second Samuel are also important because of the differences. I think in the text, it's important to know that the Septuagint is an earlier text that we have of the Hebrew Bible or of the Old Testament, but it's written in Greek. And then the Masoretic text was later, but it's written in Hebrew. So where these two things disagree, there's always been some tension because the Septuagint is older, but the Masoretic text is written in the original language, Hebrew. The Dead Sea Scrolls helped a lot to solve some of these issues, especially with First and Second Samuel, because they were both early and in Hebrew. And taking the Dead Sea Scrolls into account, we may say something like that there seem to be maybe even two separate editions of these books, rather than potentially copying each other only. They may, what we have with the Greek and the Masoretic may be reflections of two kind of editions. We should also mention that these books hold up an ideal of King David in Zion, this David-Zion ideal. Zion is the holy place. David is the ideal of the best king. But there's critiques there still, right? We've seen that the Deuteronomist is ambivalent about kings at best, because the ideal is that the whole people are in covenant with God, not just one leader, not just David. And so there are, not surprisingly, a lot of hidden, kind of barbed criticisms and some very open, blatant criticisms of even David as the best king, and certainly scathing criticisms of Saul, right? And so another interesting theme we can see here is that the Deuteronomist seems to be a little bit concerned about wisdom, maybe seeing wisdom as an alternative path to authority, right? You don't have to just follow the law, have this covenant of the law as the Deuteronomist wants. You can just follow wisdom. So it uses wisdom often in kind of evil or subversive ways. People are wise who are coming up with bad plots, basically. And then finally, the last couple books from the Deuteronomist are First and Second Kings. First and Second Kings covers the reign of Solomon. It covers the division of the kingdom after his death, right, into the northern kingdom of Israel again, southern kingdom of Judah. It includes the Elijah cycle, which is named for the prophet who's defying the king of Israel, the northern kingdom, Ahab, as he's fighting to keep worship for Yahweh as opposed to Baal and the Asherahs. There also includes the Elisha cycle. Elisha is Elijah's successor. And then finally, the Second Kings ends with Israel being taken to Assyrian exile, Judah surviving for, again, about 150 years until the Babylonian exile. So the problem with history in terms of these kings is that these books are pretty much all the history we have. The only evidence, the only written evidence we have for the existence of any of these kings is this document, or as this document of the kings. Although we do have one independent attestation. We talked about the Tel Dan inscription, in which someone was talking about their victory over someone in the house of David. So there is at least one independent proof that there was a line of David that others were talking about, not just the Jews themselves. In terms of the themes in this book, we've already suggested we see the humanity's failure at keeping God's covenant, the ambiguous value of kingship, limitations of wisdom in following God. For instance, Solomon is wise. He's the wisest of all. He asks for wisdom. But, the Deuteronomist is very clear to emphasize that only when, as Solomon, as wise as he is walking in God's way, that the covenant and the covenantal blessings are assured, right? Then there may also be we can see some possible tension between the Deuteronomist concerns and later prophetic traditions. So other prophets, which we will talk about next week, seem to be ta urging Israel to obey God directly, as God's direct speech through human beings, whatever the prophets say, and their concerns, rather than being Deuteronomic concerns, are focused on just justice for other people, honor for God, in a more unmediated, more direct kind of way. Whereas the Deuteronomist wants to always go back to the law, right? It's not just what you think is just, not just what you think honors God, but follow the law, follow what the law says, and that focus we've seen repeatedly on Jerusalem and certain kind of worship. And so, there is this kind of tension that we can see in these king cycles, in this Elijah cycle and the Elisha cycle, which try to kind of tame prophetic power, the prophetic charisma of these prophets in service of Deuteronomy's concerns, or the Deuteronomist's concerns, in First and Second Kings. And then, as we finish off this Deuteronomic cycle, we should point out that even if you take the Deuteronomist's theology on its own terms, within its own writings, there's a kind of contradiction there, because the basic premise of the Deuteronomist is that God set out a covenant with serious consequences, and people better do their part to uphold the covenant. But what we see throughout this cycle, from Deuteronomy to Second Kings, in these books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, what we see is that in practice, God is constantly withholding the consequences of this covenant, right? The point is, like, there are serious consequences, but what you see is that God, out of mercy, frequently says, well, you get a second chance or a third chance. And then the other part of the Deuteronomist's concern is that people better do their part to uphold the covenant. But even within the Deuteronomist's own story, people just fail again and again and again, like they can't really keep up their end. And so, we're certainly not the first to notice this. So there are many, many responses to the Deuteronomist, and there are many critiques and other theologies kind of vying for attention within the Hebrew Bible, and then certainly, of course, in the New Testament too. One of these we'll get to now is the chronicler, right? The First and Second Chronicles, and Ezra and Nehemiah. It's not clear that there's one author or one outlook for these four books, but we could say they do seem to be united on trying to give instructions for how Jews should live in the land after they return from exile, and they're focusing there on the temple and the priests and the Levites, the specific religious functionaries that are supporting the temple worship. The Chronicles kind of retell the story that we've been over before of the Davidic monarchy, and continue it through the destruction of Judah. Ezra and Nehemiah pick up that story and narrate the return from exile. So when the kingdom of Judah goes to Babylon, 70 years later, they're coming back, and that's Ezra and Nehemiah. They're taking up that story post-exile. So some of the differences we could say is that Chronicles, between Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah, and Chronicles is very interested in retributive justice, right? People getting their just deserts. If you're evil, if you sin, then God will punish you. Ezra and Nehemiah don't seem that focused on it. Chronicles is very focused on the Davidic dynasty, and that's very much de-emphasized, almost an afterthought for Ezra and Nehemiah. But regardless of that, again, we're holding it together because there is this focus in both of these books. If you look at the way Chronicles is talking about David, this Davidic dynasty, it's not really the same way as the Deuteronomist. It's really focused on the temple, the consecration of the temple, the importance of the temple, David preparing the materials, and Solomon building the temple. And so all of this leads to this kind of historical proof that many scholars believe these books are written at the time of the return from exile under the Persians. So the Babylonians eventually failed, and the successive kingdom after that, by the time of the exile, was the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire. And they are the ones under which there's a return. And this theology does have God's covenant with David, but not so much for David himself as the king, but as we've suggested, as the founder of the temple. So, the details of the temple are given, and the rules governing what the priests and Levites are supposed to do. Chronicles also uses the phrase Torah a lot, probably referring to the Pentateuch. So it suggests that these priests and Levites are functioning in a kind of Torah-centered religious ethic or sensibility. Some really nice parallels there with Again, possibly uh, an emphasis on Jerusalem, and also priestly concerns about cultic rules that we've seen in the Pentateuch. Then, finally, our last book of history is Esther. It's another kind of novella, a court tale, um, kind of a story not meant, again, not meant to be history, but kind of a story telling people how they should live and behave and worship, um, set in a royal court. So Esther tells the story of this Jewish girl who gets elevated to becoming the queen and how she saves her people from slaughter, giving the origins of the Jewish holiday of Purim. So there are some interesting variations in the text between the Masoretic Hebrew again and the Greek, which could reflect a complex history of the Masoretic one does not mention God at all. So that's one of the interesting points. So if you took the Masoretic text as a whole, one of its points is that God is kind of hidden behind the scenes. When He's not mentioned, God is still doing things to save God's people. The Greek makes it very clear. What it adds is there's dreams and prayers that bring God right into the story, so make God an obvious player. So it's not like they're necessarily contradicting, but there is definitely a different emphasis and a different flavor, right? Is God more hidden, or is God more obviously a character? There's also an interesting theme that gets developed. One of the major themes of the whole Hebrew Bible is the relationship between the chosen people, right, Israel, and the nations or the Gentiles. We have hostile Gentiles that are clearly villains, like Haman, but others that are maybe just gullible or that can be friendly, like the king. But clearly, the main characters in the whole story are the Israelites. They are God's chosen and protected people. So that ends our historical section. Um, Maybe because this is quite long, I will just cut this off here and then give another shorter lecture on the wisdom section.